There's a moment that happens, and maybe you've had it, where you're sitting in a room, watching something unfold with your grandchild, and you know exactly what you'd do. You've handled moments like this dozens of times, maybe hundreds, and for a second, your body even starts to move. And then you stop. You wait. You watch someone else handle it. And it goes fine. Everything goes fine. And you sit back. And there's something in that pause that's hard to name. It's not frustration. It's not hurt. It's something quieter than both of those things. A kind of stillness that wasn't there before. Like you've just noticed, for the first time, that the room has rearranged itself, and nobody sent you the memo. If you felt something like that, this video might put words to something you've been carrying for a while. Before anything else, it's worth saying this clearly. The kind of man who pauses in that moment, who holds back, who waits, who weighs whether to step in, that's not weakness. That's not uncertainty in a negative sense. That's actually someone who cares enough to stop and think. And that matters. Most of the men who reach the point of becoming a grandfather have spent decades being the person who knew what to do. Not because someone gave them a certificate, but because life handed them situations and they showed up. They figured it out. They built something, a family, a household, a presence that people leaned on. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because they paid attention, they took responsibility, and they didn't wait for someone else to lead when leading was needed. So when something shifts, when the dynamic quietly changes, and the role that used to feel automatic starts to feel a little less clear, that's not a small thing. Even if it never gets said out loud. Even if no one around you seems to notice it at all. And here's what's worth understanding early on. This experience, this quiet uncertainty about where you fit in the new structure, is far more common than it might seem. It's just not something men tend to talk about. Not because they don't feel it, but because it doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories they've been given. It's not grief. It's not conflict. It's not a problem with anyone. It's something more subtle than all of that. And subtle things are the hardest to put into words. What's also worth saying, before going any further, is that nobody in this dynamic is doing anything wrong. Not you. Not your children. Not your daughter or son-in-law. Everyone is navigating their own version of a new situation. The parents are building their own authority, figuring out their own way of doing things. And you, without anyone necessarily meaning for this to happen, have stepped into a role that nobody ever described to you. A role that's real and meaningful and genuinely important, but that didn't come with a clear set of instructions about when to act and when to step back. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it might explain quite a lot. Think about a Sunday afternoon. The grandchildren are over. There's some kind of small incident, nothing serious, just one of those moments that happens when kids are kids. And you see it unfold. And in your mind, without even thinking about it, you already know how you'd handle it. You've seen a version of this 100 times. You know what works. And then one of the parents steps in, and they do it differently than you would have. Maybe they're more lenient. Maybe they're more firm. Maybe they use words you wouldn't have used. And it works. The moment passes. The kids move on. And you didn't say anything. And that was probably the right call. But here's what's easy to miss. The fact that you held back in that moment didn't come from indifference. It came from awareness. You made a choice, quickly, quietly, without anyone noticing, to let someone else lead. And that's actually a sophisticated thing to do. It just doesn't feel sophisticated in the moment. In the moment, it can feel a little like standing just outside a circle you used to stand in the center of. And once you start noticing that feeling, you start noticing how often it appears. There's something that tends to happen gradually, in the first year or two of becoming a grandfather. It's not a single dramatic shift. It's more like a series of small recalibrations, each one barely noticeable on its own. You start thinking before you speak in situations where you used to speak naturally. You begin to read the room before offering an opinion, even when the opinion is something you're confident about. You find yourself pausing before picking up a grandchild in a certain way, or suggesting a certain approach, or redirecting a moment the way you would have redirected it with your own children. Not because you've been told not to, but because you've started to sense, correctly, that this is a different kind of territory now. And that increased self-monitoring, that new habit of measuring your actions before taking them, it's actually a sign of intelligence. It means you understand something important about the situation. But it can also be quietly exhausting in a way that's hard to explain, because you're spending energy on calculations that never used to require any effort at all. There's something worth pausing on here. For most of your adult life, you operated from a kind of instinctive authority, not arrogance, just the natural confidence that comes from being the person who is responsible. You didn't need to wonder if your input was wanted, because you were in the position where your input was always relevant. And now, for the first time in a long time, you're in a position where that's no longer automatically true. And the adjustment to that, the shift from acting instinctively to acting thoughtfully, is a real adjustment, even if nobody else can see it happening. There's a particular kind of moment that seems to come up a lot for men in this transition. It's not a big moment. It's almost invisible, but it tends to leave a small mark. Someone is talking about a decision. Maybe it's about how to handle something with one of the kids, or where the family is going for the holidays, or how something is going to be organized. And you have a thought, a clear, concrete, probably useful thought, and you start to form it into words. And then something in you hesitates, and you hold it back, or you offer it gently, carefully, in a way you wouldn't have 10 years ago, and you wait to see how it lands. And sometimes it lands well, and sometimes it gets acknowledged politely and then set aside, and you sit with that. Now, from the outside, that moment might not look like much. The conversation moves on. No one's upset. Nobody left the room. But on the inside, something was quietly navigated. A question was asked and answered, without anyone realizing a question had even been asked. Am I the one who should be weighing in here, or not? And it's possible that having to ask that question, for a man who spent decades in a position where the question never came up, is one of the more disorienting parts of this whole transition. Here's something that doesn't get talked about much, but it might be one of the most significant parts of this shift. For most of a man's life, in his role as son, then husband, then father, then professional, there's a kind of clarity about position. Not always, not perfectly, but there's a general structure that tells you where you stand and what's expected of you. Even the difficult parts of those roles are difficult in familiar ways. You know what you're navigating. Becoming a grandfather is different, because it's a role that exists in real, meaningful ways. You matter to these kids, you're present, you're part of their world, but the authority that used to come attached to your presence is no longer automatic. You're not the one making the calls. You're not the one responsible for the outcomes. And that's appropriate. That's how it should be. But it creates something that most men aren't really prepared for. A position of importance without a clear structure of decision-making authority. And when you've spent a lifetime operating with both of those things together, presence and authority, involvement and responsibility, having one without the other is something your system has to quietly learn to adjust to. This is the part that tends to surprise people. Not the love. The love is obvious. Not the connection. That's there from the start. It's the structural ambiguity. The not quite knowing when it's your moment and when it isn't. That's the part that takes time. Watch a grandfather with his grandchildren for a little while, and you'll often notice something interesting. He's observant in a way that's different from the parents. His eyes track things. He notices what's happening on the edges of the room. He sees the small dynamics. Which child is getting quiet? Which one is showing off? Which one needs a moment? He sees all of it. But he doesn't always act on what he sees. Sometimes he just holds it, sits with it, watches. And there's a chance that this quality, this capacity to observe without immediately intervening, is actually something that develops precisely because of the shift in role. When you're no longer automatically in charge, you start to see differently. You're not in problem-solving mode the whole time. You're in a different mode, one that's quieter, maybe, but possibly more perceptive. And it's possible that the grandchildren pick up on this. Not consciously, not in a way they'd be able to articulate. But children are very sensitive to who in the room is truly paying attention. And a grandfather who is genuinely watching, not directing, not managing, just present and attentive, can be a remarkably grounding presence, even when he says very little. That's not a small thing, even if it doesn't feel like much from the inside. There's another layer to this that's worth naming, because it happens quietly and can create a subtle kind of tension that's hard to locate. When you've been the decision maker for a long time, your instincts are calibrated toward action. You see a situation, you assess it, and you respond. That's not a habit. It's closer to a reflex. It's the result of years of being in positions where hesitation had a cost. And now you're in a situation where hesitation is often the right move. Where waiting, watching, letting things unfold on their own, that's often exactly what's called for. And your instincts, which served you extraordinarily well for decades, are now occasionally pointing in the wrong direction. Not because they're wrong, but because the context has changed. And recalibrating instincts is harder than recalibrating behavior. You can decide to say less. You can decide to hold back. But the part of you that's already formed an assessment, that's already identified what should happen and is ready to make it happen, that part doesn't quiet down just because you've decided not to act on it. It's still there, still running. And that background process, that constant slight friction between the instinct to act and the decision to wait, that's part of what makes this transition quietly tiring in a way that's not easy to explain to anyone. And once you see this dynamic, it's hard to unsee it in the smaller moments. The meal where someone else is carving and you're sitting down. The conversation where someone younger is explaining something you already know and you let them finish. The moment where a grandchild is upset and a parent handles it in a way you wouldn't have and you stay in your seat. None of these moments is dramatic. None of them is a crisis. But each one involves a small, quiet act of stepping back from a position you used to occupy naturally. And over time, those moments accumulate into something larger. Into a new understanding of what it means to be the elder in the room without being the one in charge of the room. That's a genuinely different thing than what most men have practiced. And it takes longer to settle into than you'd expect, partly because nobody warns you that settling is required. There's something worth considering about what this shift actually means in the longer arc of a life. A man who has spent 40 years building authority, in his work, in his home, in his relationships, has done something real. That authority didn't come from nowhere. It came from showing up, from being reliable, from handling things well enough that people came to count on him. And that history doesn't disappear when the grandchildren arrive. It lives in the structure of the family, in how his children carry themselves, in the habits and values that got passed down, whether or not anyone is naming that explicitly. What changes is not the significance of what he built. What changes is the mode. From active construction to quiet foundation. From leading the moment to holding the space. And those two things look very different from the inside. But from the outside, from the perspective of the grandchildren growing up in that family, they may be almost equally important. The grandfather who is present, who is steady, who shows up and pays attention and occasionally says the right thing at the right moment. That figure leaves a mark. Not through authority, not through being in charge, but through something that might be harder to name and possibly more lasting. There's one more thing that seems worth saying. No one really prepares men for this transition. Not in any concrete way. There are plenty of things said about becoming a grandfather. How meaningful it is, how special the relationship is, how different it feels from being a parent. And all of that is true. But the structural part, the internal recalibration, the quiet work of figuring out what your role actually is now, that tends to get left out of the conversation entirely. Which means most men navigate it alone. Not in crisis, not in distress, but quietly, privately, in the small moments where they pause instead of act, where they hold back instead of step in, where they sit with a thought they decided not to voice. And there's a chance that just naming that, just acknowledging that this navigation is real, that it takes something, that it's not nothing, might make some part of it feel a little less like something that's wrong with you, and a little more like something that simply comes with the territory. Maybe the simplest way to say what this video has been circling around is this. After a lifetime of knowing when to step in, becoming a grandfather is one of the first roles that asks you to figure out, largely on your own, when to step back. And how. And what that even looks like for a man like you, in a family like yours, with the particular history you've built. There's no manual for that. There's no clear moment where someone explains the new structure and hands you the rules. There's just the quiet work of paying attention, of being present in a different way than before, of learning, slowly and without much fanfare, that the room still needs you. It just needs you differently now. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe it's just the next thing. If this put words to something you've been sitting with, feel free to share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. And if you have something to add, something you've noticed, something you've felt, the comments are there. It's worth saying out loud sometimes.